He walked into the courtroom with his shoulders slumped, eyes red, hands trembling, like they were carrying a weight far heavier than paperwork. Before he ever said a word, you could already see it. This wasn't just another case. This was a man who hadn't slept, a man who had run out of options, a man who had finally reached the end of his strength. He stood there quietly while his name was called. When he looked up, his voice cracked before he could even speak. He tried to explain himself, but his words came out tangled with emotion. He apologized again and again, not just for the ticket in his hand, but for his life feeling like it was falling apart. He talked about losing his job after his company downsized, about how he had been trying to keep up with rent, groceries, and gas, and how some days he had to choose which one mattered more. He talked about driving his mother to her medical appointments in an old car that barely made it down the street, praying each time it would start again. He said the day he was pulled over, he wasn't being careless. He was scared. Scared of being late. Scared of losing the only temporary work he had found, scared of becoming someone his family could no longer depend on. And when he finished speaking, the courtroom went quiet, not because anyone was bored, but because everyone understood. You could see it in the faces of the people sitting behind him, strangers who suddenly didn't feel so distant anymore, because every person in that room had known pressure, every person had known fear, every person had known what it feels like to be one bad week away from everything falling apart. He wiped his face with his sleeve and whispered, "I'm just trying to survive." That sentence didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like the truth. The law is meant to guide people, not crush them. And justice isn't only about rules. It's about recognizing humanity when it stands right in front of you. So instead of cold words and quick penalties, he was asked something simple. How are you really doing? That question broke him, because no one had asked him that in a long time. He spoke about the nights he sat in his car, just to cry where his family couldn't see him, about the days he skipped meals so his mother could eat, about how he felt like he was failing everyone, even though he was giving everything he had. And right there, in that moment, something shifted, not just in him, in the entire room, because it became clear that this wasn't a careless man who needed punishment. This was a tired man who needed understanding. So instead of adding another burden to his shoulders, something different happened. He was reminded that mistakes don't define a person. Effort does. That falling behind doesn't make you a failure. Giving up does. That being overwhelmed doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The fine was reduced. The deadline was extended. Resources were offered. But more than that, dignity was returned. And when he realized he wasn't about to be crushed by the system, he started to cry again. But this time it was different. These weren't tears of fear, they were tears of relief, tears of being seen, tears of finally breathing again. He stood a little straighter. He thanked everyone in the room. He promised to keep pushing forward. And when he walked out of that courtroom, he wasn't just walking away from a case. He was walking away with hope, because sometimes one moment of compassion can do what years of punishment never could. It can remind someone that they still matter, that they are not alone, that their story isn't over. He walked into court crying. He walked out changed forever. He stood at the doorway of the courtroom long before his name was called, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, staring down at the floor as if it might open and swallow him whole. His eyes were swollen and red, not the kind of red that comes from a long night of celebration, but the deep, aching red that only comes from crying when no one is there to see it. His shoulders curved inward, as if he were trying to make himself smaller, like shrinking might somehow make the problem disappear. In his hands he clutched a folded piece of paper that had been unfolded and refolded so many times it was soft and worn at the edges, a quiet sign of how many nights he had spent reading and rereading the words written on it, trying to make sense of what his life had come to. When his name was finally called, he flinched. It was a small reaction, but it spoke volumes. He lifted his head slowly, like someone lifting a heavy weight, and took a hesitant step forward. Every movement felt cautious, deliberate, as if one wrong move might cause everything to collapse. He swallowed hard before he spoke, and even before a single word came out, his eyes filled again. It wasn't just nervousness, it was fear layered on top of exhaustion. Exhaustion layered on top of months, maybe years, of carrying more than he felt capable of carrying. He apologized before anyone asked him to. His voice shook, breaking in the middle of sentences, forcing him to pause just to breathe. Each apology sounded less like a formality and more like a confession, as if he were asking forgiveness not only for what brought him into the courtroom, but for all the ways he felt he had failed in life. He He kept his gaze low, rarely looking up, like he didn't feel worthy of meeting anyone's eyes. When he did glance up, it was quick and uncertain, as though he were afraid of what he might see reflected back at him. He explained that he hadn't always been like this. There was a time when he felt steady, when he had routine, when bills were paid on time, and worries stayed within manageable limits. He talked about how his job had been his anchor, how it gave him not just money but structure, a sense of purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning feeling like he was moving forward. Losing that job had been more than a financial hit. It had shaken his identity. It made him question his value, his role, his ability to provide and protect the people who depended on him. As his income disappeared, his confidence followed. He described the way each week became a calculation, a careful balancing act of what could be paid and what would have to wait. Rent sat on one side of the scale, groceries on the other, utilities hanging in between. He spoke about standing in store aisles, comparing prices down to the smallest difference, putting items back on shelves, choosing cheaper options that never quite lasted long enough. He admitted there were nights when he went to bed hungry so someone else in his home wouldn't have to. The pressure built quietly at first, then all at once. He said there were mornings he sat in his car before turning the key, gripping the steering wheel, taking deep breaths to steady himself before facing another day of uncertainty. He talked about the shame of asking for help, the fear of becoming a burden, the constant mental weight of wondering how long he could keep going before something finally gave way. Every responsibility felt heavier when he didn't know where the next paycheck would come from. By the time he reached the moment that led him into court, his voice was barely holding together. He explained that on that day, his mind had been racing with deadlines and promises he was trying desperately to keep. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was thinking about getting to where he needed to be on time, about not losing the small opportunity he had managed to secure, about holding on to anything that might help him climb back to stability. His mistake wasn't rooted in disregard. It was rooted in panic, in a moment where fear took over and logic took a back seat. As he spoke, his hands trembled, his fingers twisted around each other, pulling at his sleeves, pressing his palms together as if he were trying to physically contain the emotions threatening to spill out. He paused often, not for effect, but because his throat tightened and his chest felt too heavy to let words pass through easily. He wiped his face repeatedly, embarrassed by the tears, but unable to stop them, each tear carrying frustration, regret, and the quiet pain of feeling like he had let everyone down. He said he didn't recognize himself anymore. The man he used to be felt distant, like a memory belonging to someone else. He missed the version of himself who laughed more easily, who slept through the night, who didn't flinch at the sound of his phone ringing with another bill collector on the line. He spoke about how his world had shrunk, how joy had been replaced with worry, how hope had been replaced with a constant sense of waiting for something else to go wrong. He wasn't asking for sympathy, he was asking to be understood. He wanted someone to see that behind the paperwork, behind the violation, behind the few minutes that had landed him there, was a person who was trying. Even if his efforts didn't always look perfect on paper, he wanted it to be known that he wasn't careless by nature, that he wasn't someone who took rules lightly, that he hadn't woken up that morning intending to cause trouble or harm. He was a man who had reached the edge of his emotional strength, a man who was tired of feeling like he was always one step behind. A man who had been carrying silent battles no one else could see. A man who walked into the courtroom not just with a case number, but with fear in his chest, shame in his thoughts, and a heart that had been stretched thin by months of trying to hold everything together while it slowly slipped through his fingers. He took a deep breath before continuing, the kind of breath people take when they are about to say something they've been holding inside for far too long. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, tracing invisible lines along the tiles, as if he could follow them to a place where things made sense again. When he spoke this time, his voice was quieter, steadier in tone, but heavier in meaning, like each word carried a memory he had replayed in his mind 1,000 times. He talked about the life he had been trying to protect. Not a glamorous life, not a life of comfort, but a simple one built on responsibility and care. He described his home as modest, a place where everything had its place because there was no room for excess. He spoke about mornings that started early and nights that ended late, all centered around making sure the people under his roof were safe, fed, and looked after. He said he never imagined himself standing in a courtroom one day explaining his life to strangers, but here he was, doing exactly that because the quiet battles he had been fighting had finally spilled into public view. He spoke about his family with a softness that contrasted with the tension in his shoulders. He described how he had become the one everyone leaned on, the one who made phone calls, filled out paperwork, drove to appointments, and tried to keep everything from falling apart. He talked about a parent whose health had been slowly declining, about medications that were necessary but expensive, about the long waits in clinics and the worry that sat in his chest each time a new symptom appeared. He admitted that there were days he felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for test results, waiting for answers, waiting for reassurance that never seemed to last long. Money became a constant source of stress. He explained how every dollar had to be stretched, how every unexpected expense felt like a small disaster. He talked about the way he kept a mental list of what could be delayed and what absolutely could not. Rent couldn't wait. Medicine couldn't wait. Utilities couldn't wait. Everything else had to fall into line behind those priorities. He confessed that he had become an expert at making sacrifices quietly, giving up small comforts without mentioning them to anyone, pretending he was fine even when he wasn't. The mistake that brought him there wasn't something he took lightly. He made it clear that he understood the importance of rules and the reason they exist. He wasn't trying to defend the action itself as right. What he was trying to explain was the state of mind he had been in. He described that day as one long rush of thoughts colliding with each other. He had been late. He had been anxious. His phone had been ringing with reminders and requests. He had been thinking about a doctor's appointment he couldn't miss and a temporary job that might disappear if he showed up late again. His focus had narrowed until all he could see was the need to get from one place to another without losing the fragile progress he had made. He admitted that fear had guided him more than reason, fear of losing income, fear of disappointing his family, fear of becoming someone who could no longer provide. He said that fear had a way of drowning out the voice of caution, making small risks seem acceptable when the alternative felt unbearable. He wasn't proud of it. He wasn't dismissing responsibility. He was simply telling the truth about what had been happening inside his head in those moments. As he spoke, his words painted a picture of someone who was constantly calculating, constantly planning, constantly worrying. He described nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, wondering how to stretch what little he had to cover what he needed. He talked about the feeling of checking his bank account before making even the smallest purchase, the hesitation that came before every decision, the quiet panic that rose whenever an unexpected expense appeared. He shared how his relationships had been affected. He had grown quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped reaching out to friends because he didn't want to explain why he was always tired, why he was always busy, why he could never go out anymore. He said he felt embarrassed by his situation, ashamed to admit how much he was struggling. He became skilled at smiling and saying he was fine while his mind was constantly running through lists of responsibilities and worries. He wasn't asking to be excused from accountability. He was asking for recognition of the context behind his actions. He wanted it to be understood that his mistake didn't come from carelessness or arrogance, but from a life that had become too heavy to carry alone. He wanted people to see that his intentions had never been reckless, that he hadn't woken up that day planning to disregard anyone's safety or well-being. He had simply been trying to keep everything from falling apart. He spoke about the moment he realized he had been pulled over, how his stomach dropped, how his hands had begun to shake, how he already knew the consequences could make everything harder. He remembered sitting there, staring ahead, feeling a wave of dread wash over him as he thought about what this would mean for his already fragile situation. He talked about the embarrassment of explaining himself, the fear of judgment, the worry that this one mistake would overshadow all the effort he had been putting in. What he wanted most was to be seen not as a problem, but as a person who had been trying to do right by the people he loved, a person who had been making choices under pressure, sometimes poorly, but never with malicious intent, a person whose mistake was real, but whose heart was equally real, shaped by sacrifice, responsibility, and a quiet determination to keep going even when every step felt heavier than the last. He stood there waiting, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, shoulders still tense, as if he were bracing for something heavy to fall. His breathing was shallow, careful, and his eyes kept darting toward the bench, and then back down again. He had said everything he could say. Every truth he had been carrying had been placed out in the open, and now there was nothing left to hide behind. All that remained was the outcome, and the uncertainty of it pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The room felt different now. It wasn't filled with noise or movement, but with attention. People who had been distracted moments earlier were sitting still, leaning forward slightly, listening in a way that went beyond curiosity. There was a shared sense that something more than paperwork had just passed through the space. This was no longer simply about a citation or a violation. It had become about a person whose life had been laid bare in front of strangers. Instead of hearing cold instructions or a swift declaration of penalties, he heard a voice that was calm and steady, not rushed, not dismissive. The tone carried respect, it carried patience. It acknowledged the difficulty of what had been shared and the courage it took to speak honestly in such a public place. Those first few words alone caused his eyes to widen slightly, as if he hadn't expected to be addressed as a human being before being addressed as a case. He was asked about his situation again, but this time not in a formal, mechanical way. The questions were gentle, thoughtful, meant to understand rather than to interrogate. He answered slowly, choosing his words carefully, still unsure of where things were headed, but feeling something unfamiliar settling into the space around him. It wasn't fear, it was the quiet possibility that he might not be crushed under the weight of his mistake. He listened as compassion entered the conversation, not as weakness, but as wisdom. He was reminded that accountability and understanding can exist in the same moment, that consequences can be shaped by context, that the purpose of the system is not only to correct behavior, but to encourage people to do better, to lift them towards stability, rather than push them deeper into despair. The burden that had been sitting on his shoulders began to loosen its grip. It didn't vanish instantly, but it shifted, like a heavy load that had finally been adjusted, so it no longer cut into his back with every movement. His breathing slowed, his hands stopped trembling, his eyes lifted for longer than just a second at a time. He was told that his effort mattered, that the struggles he described were real, that the sacrifices he had been making for his family were seen. Those words struck something deep inside him. For months, maybe longer, he had felt invisible, like his work and worry and quiet endurance had gone unnoticed by the world. To hear them acknowledged out loud, in a place he had entered with fear, caused his chest to tighten and his eyes to fill once more. But these tears were different. They weren't born from panic. They came from relief. From the sudden realization that he was not alone in that room, that he wasn't being reduced to a mistake, that someone had chosen to look at the whole picture of his life instead of just one moment within it. The fine was not treated as a weapon. It was adjusted with reason. The timeline was extended with understanding. Options were explained instead of imposed. Resources were mentioned. Guidance was offered. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a path forward instead of a wall in front of him. He nodded quietly as he listened, absorbing every word, committing them to memory as if they were instructions for rebuilding something that had nearly collapsed. He whispered, "Thank you," more than once, his voice barely above a breath. Not because he was told to, but because gratitude was the only thing he could find words for in that moment. His posture changed almost without him noticing. His shoulders lifted slightly. His head remained up. His eyes no longer darted nervously around the room. There was a subtle shift in the way he stood, as though the weight he had been carrying had been redistributed, leaving him steadier on his feet. He began to imagine what the next few weeks might look like. How he could organize his time better, how he could plan payments without panic, how he could speak to his family with honesty instead of shame. He thought about sleeping through the night without waking up to the same tight knot of worry in his chest. He thought about waking up with purpose again. The room slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but he remained rooted in place for a moment longer, taking in what had just happened. He wasn't just walking away from a decision. He was walking away with renewed strength, with dignity restored, with a reminder that he was capable of getting back on his feet. When he finally turned to leave, he moved with more confidence than when he had entered. His steps were steadier, his breathing was deeper, his mind was clearer. He held on to the feeling that had been given to him in that space, the feeling of being seen, understood, and given a chance to move forward.